Prince Caspian movie review. So this is the second movie in the Chronicles of Narnia series. I never actually reviewed the first movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And that's because that movie came out, I believe, in 2005, and I did not start my project of systematically reviewing every movie I see until 2007. This is one of my scripted reviews where I go back and read one of the old reviews off of the blog. I'll give a brief background maybe on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and my thoughts on the franchise as a whole, etc. I grew up in a conservative Protestant area. I went to religious schools and Sunday school. So if you're familiar with Protestant America, you know C.S. Lewis and the Narnia series are big there. And I had these books read to me as a child several times over. I think my mom read them to us. I think my first grade teacher read them to us, and also maybe our second grade teacher. I haven't gone back to them in years, and I'm probably overdue for a rereading. I never actually finished the whole series anyways. I think the fifth book was as far as I got. My parents and my school teachers, I remember, read the first two books to us, but from the third book on, we were on our own to go into the library and find them. So yes, at some point I'm due to come back to these books and reread them. Dane Reads over at the Dane Reads YouTube channel, not so long ago, reread these books and gave his thoughts on them. And I'm not quite sure how they would hold up as an adult, but I do have some vague memories of them. And anyways, the first movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I don't know if you remember this, but there was, when it came out, it was not at all certain that this movie would be good. There were certain potholes that it could have fallen into. For one thing, it came out right after the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So there was some concern that it would just try and duplicate and try and be the next Lord of the Rings. But the other thing was that it came out shortly after the Passion of the Christ had been a big thing and had demonstrated that the evangelical market could be made money off of, that there were Christians who had money to spend, and this was a new market that was opening up. So there was a danger that, one, the movie could just be like another thing in the culture wars where it was just going after one specific audience and being a little bit too preachy. And along with that, there was maybe a danger that they would get rid of the epic storytellingness of it and just make it into more of a Christian teaching movie. But then the other danger was that they would go too far in the other direction and try and make it the next Lord of the Rings. And there's all this, I guess every time they adapt a beloved childhood book, there are all these concerns about which direction they're going to go with it. And I thought, for the most part, the The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie did fine. And they did a good job of navigating that. I had a friend who pointed out to me that some of the language from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was tweaked a little bit from the novel to make the religious symbolism a little bit harder to miss. I didn't actually catch this myself, but he posted a review of it on his blog in which he talked a little bit about it. It got tweaked very slightly, but no big deal, as far as I'm concerned at least. The other thing, my mother had the criticism that in the actual novel, the battle scenes don't take up that much space in the novel. They're like, one page where it just said, and then there's a big battle or something like that. Whereas in the movie, they make this big epic thing about the battle at the end of the movie. Lindsay Ellis, a popular YouTuber, had a similar criticism, and I don't remember which video this was off of, because she never did a whole video on this. She talked about it briefly by way of comparison. I don't remember what she was comparing it to. Sorry, but she makes a point that the marketing for this movie and the movie itself, they were really trying to sell it as epic after the Lord of the Rings movie. She makes a point that this was, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was not an epic battle Lord of the Rings movie. It was, you know, a child's story that was on a much lower adrenaline level. Sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? The epicness of it was on a much lower level. It was just supposed to be more of a childhood fairy tale. Which, you know, if you reread the book, which I haven't done in years, but apparently that comes through. I don't know. Maybe I wanted something a lot more epic and with a lot more fighting, just because I like action movies. But also I'm of the opinion that when you make a movie, you have to make a big meal of this. I mean, in a book, it's perfectly fine to say, and there was a big battle. But in the movie, you need to show the battle. Movies are just a different medium. So I didn't really have a problem with it. All that is a setup for the review of Prince Caspian, which I also thought was pretty good. There's some interesting stuff going on in this. There was an interesting little thing at the beginning, which when they showed the children, what were their names? The Peavy's children, Pimsey's children, I forget. They showed how it was difficult for them to transition back into being ordinary children in England after they had been kings and queens for years in the previous book. Which I believe is something that C.S. Lewis never touched on. How they could go from being kings and queens and transition back to being children and being picked on in school and kind of all the stuff that goes along with being a child. I don't think that was ever in any of C.S. Lewis's books, but it's an interesting thing to pick up on. And then Lev Grossman later would pick up on it in The Magicians. But I don't credit Lev Grossman with a lot of originality on that, because I think in these movies, not in the books itself, but in these Narnia movies, they do try and explore the transition from being kings and queens to being ordinary children. Then they go back into Narnia, and I remember this vaguely from the books, but I had kind of forgotten it, that there was a time skip now, because time in Narnia works differently. So now it's thousands of years later, thousands of years, hundreds of years. It's way later than the original story and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So, you know, all the characters in the original Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, except for, like, obviously Aslan and stuff like that, are long dead, and it's all become myths and legends. And I thought there was a very nice atmosphere that they created in the movie, this sense of how things have changed in time and how everything they used to know has now become ruins. I thought that was very nicely visually done in the movie. As well as just kind of the sense of wonder and enchantment of entering a fantasy world, which was in the first movie, but they did well again here in the second movie. It's all filmed in New Zealand, and the scenery is gorgeous. But, you know, when I was living in Japan, I was living next to a guy from New Zealand who used to tell me over and over again how gorgeous New Zealand was. And this was way back in the day, before, you know, the Lord of the Rings movies or the Hobbits or any of these movies had come out. But yeah, every movie that comes out that's shot in New Zealand looks like it's absolutely gorgeous. I regret that I never made it over to New Zealand. Maybe one of these days. Yeah. So the action scenes in this movie were good. The various battle scenes were well choreographed and very exciting. Yeah, on the whole, I enjoyed this movie. Now, I don't know if this is even worth talking about, but there were a couple minor controversies when this movie came out, none of which are really essential to the enjoyment of the movie itself, meaning you can just forget about the external controversies and enjoy the movie. But there was this silly thing when this came out because the Golden Compass was coming out around the same time. So I think Christians were viewing the box office of Prince Caspian versus the box office of the Golden Compass as some sort of victory in the culture wars, which was just silly. This whole culture wars thing, which has gotten even more silly, or yeah, I don't know if silly is even the word for it now. More silly under Donald Trump, is just ridiculous. But the other thing is there was some talk about the violence in this movie, which went both ways, I think. There were some secular critics who were criticizing it for being too violent when it was supposed to be a Christian movie. And then there's some Christian critics who are being a little bit too soft on it because it was a Christian movie. And I don't know, maybe some other stuff going on as well. I mean, it's an interesting question. Like when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I always loved action or violence in media, right? I was never allowed to watch the most violent stuff. Like I remember the Terminator movies were big when I was a kid. I couldn't watch them. But I liked watching He-Man on TV, and He-Man would fight the bad guys. But then you go to Sunday school and you'd be taught that it was wrong to enjoy watching violence on TV, even though the violence in He-Man was rather tame. So I always felt guilty about it, and yet I was always inexplicably drawn to it, which I think most children, especially most boys, are. So there is always this conflict. I think if you go back through the history of literature, well, sorry, let me back up. The church has long made a big deal of criticizing sex and violence in media, and yet sex and violence is what makes media interesting. I mean, I think if you go back through the history of literature, not only Western literature, but literature in general, the Iliad, Ovid, Shakespeare, Romance of the Three Kingdoms from China, Tales of the Heki or the Tales of Genji from Japan, all of it seems to be based on sex or violence. It's not always explicit, but it's always there in some degree. And you really, I don't know if you can have an interesting story without at least some violence or at least some sex that's in it as well. And you could even almost include the Christian mythology in this, or the Old Testament part of the Christian mythology, which is inherited from the Jewish mythology. At the same time, I do strongly believe that violence in the real world is bad. So there's always that sticky question about the morality of violence in fiction. The Focus on the Family did an interesting Focus on the Family is a Christian organization in America. They did an interesting review of this movie, in which they said, yes, there's a lot of violence, but don't worry, it's all bloodless, so it's relatively okay. Which is, I don't know, maybe. There is the argument on the other side of that, though, that the cartoon violence, the sanitizing violence, is even worse than the realistic violence, because it gives the idea that violence is consequence-free and everybody fights but nobody gets hurt, and there's no gore or stuff like that. There was an argument, I think, when these realistic violence movies first started coming out at the end of the 60s. The filmmakers said, we're going to show violence with all its gore to make it unappealing, because it's been too sanitized, and that's what led to the Vietnam War or something like that. The idea that the violence or fighting doesn't have realistic consequences. So I guess there's that debate whether it's better or worse for society to have this kind of PG violence in which there's no blood and no gore, etc. And yet at the same time, when I do see like a really gory, violent movie, it does repulse me. Although I guess that's the whole point, right? That's what it's meant to do. So, having raised all these questions, I'm just going to leave them because I don't have satisfying answers to any of it, other than to comment that this was kind of an issue when this movie came out, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. To be fair, I guess, or to come back around again, this would not have been talked about so much if this had been any other movie. In other words, if this movie hadn't already had a religious following attached to it. But you know, the thing about the Chronicles of Narnia books and the movies as well is, do you need to get into all this talk about religion? Or can you just take these as fantasy movies that have an extra layer of religion that you can take or leave as you like? Which, if you come back to the original, if you come back to the movies, can you just leave that whole debate aside and just have these as fun fantasy adventure movies? I'm inclined to just enjoy these as fun fantasy adventure movies, but I don't know. Sorry, I'm rambling. I'm just going to leave it here.